And then the remainder would be covered by Hennepin County sources. So their portion of the sales and use tax, Hennepin County Regional Rail Authority, property taxes, et cetera. And then for operation costs, there would be a net increase of about 329 million in operating costs over the life of the TPP. So from the first full year of operation in 2031, with about 56.5 million in operating and maintenance costs for the year, and then we inflated that out to 2050. Ferries would cover about 39 million of that cost, and then the remainder would be covered by unallocated sales and use tax, which we have identified currently in the 2050 TPP, and this would eat up part of that unallocated portion of the sales and use tax revenues. For Gold Line extension, there would be no net capital cost compared to the current 2050 TPP. There is a cost to building the line. It's about estimated 25 million. That's for buses and 2 new station locations, one at Snelling and 94, and then one in downtown Minneapolis near the Viking Stadium. This would be covered by existing Metro Transit sources, which is why there's no net cost for capital expenses as far as the TPP is concerned. For operating costs, we're projecting a net increase of 128 million compared to the current TPP. Essentially, we got there by taking the current Route 94 operating costs for 2028 and doubling them, because the route will essentially be replacing Route 94 and operating at twice the frequency. Fares would be anticipated to cover about 30 million of that, with the rest being that same source of unallocated sales and use tax. And this is covered in the amendment in your packets, but we did analyze equity impacts, environmental justice, and then the regional performance outcomes, which are included in the TPP. What we did essentially was incorporated these changes into the build scenario and compared back to our no build scenario for the plan. The main message is, these projects have positive impacts for the region at a regional scale. They're fairly minor compared to the original build scenario of the TPP, because we already had Blue Line extension in the plan. The route is just slightly different, and the frequency is a bit higher. And then we already had Route 94 as well. This is more of a service frequency increase. So we see benefits for access to destinations, and some benefits particularly for zero-car households with Blue Line. But they aren't, big major changes, because these projects in part were already in that plan. And then there'll be a few updates to maps and updates to like our long-range capital projects list. Just kind of more administrative changes within the plan. As far as the schedule, you can see we presented to TAC yesterday. We'll be presenting our information item, the same as you all heard, to TAB on the 21st and the Transportation Committee. And then you're our first stop for the release for public comment, and we plan to go to TAC in June. So that's everything I have, and I'm happy to answer questions and go back to any slides if folks need.
Thank you. Does any of the committee members have any questions or comments? Innocent?
Yes.
Go.
Yeah, on the slides that shows that you did equity and environmental justice impact analysis. Is it possible to explain what type of benefits that the EJ community would derive from these projects? And if there are also some impacts, can we know what type of impact that you're expecting?
I would have to, it is described in the amendment. Thank you for the question, Chair and Member. I would have to go back and look at the section itself in the amendment, but it is described in there. I think the main thing we're finding is that we don't expect to have disproportionate impacts, although it's not a full Title VI analysis.
it would affect like replacement of people that they have to move out from their homes and.
Oh, gotcha. Maybe I'll defer, Nick, if you want to talk a bit about the anti-displacement work for the Blue Line extension particularly.
Yep. So Blue Line extension, will we have, of course, transways do have some property impacts, and so we're working through that and following our right-of-way process. But one component of the Blue Line extension, which is a new component for transitways, is there's state funding for anti-displacement efforts, where we try to retain businesses and households that want to stay within the corridor and benefit from the investment of the capital investment. And so there's a series of strategies for anti-displacement and then within our mitigation package that is in our environmental document, there will also be some anti-displacement mitigation items specific, assuming this environmental document is approved this year. And so, we will have some relocations, of course, but we're trying to minimize that through the project and then protect those that want to stay in the corridor that are often feel they're displaced by rising property values from the investment.
And if I could add one more thing, and isn't just for the amendment itself, the analysis we did was more about the transit service as opposed to what you're asking about.
All right, thank you. Dave, did you also have a question?
Yeah, thanks. Bradley and Nick, can you please just briefly kind of describe, this is all preface kind of on the assumption that we're going to receive an increase in the capital investment grant. Should that money, for whatever reason, not come through, is there any sort of backup plan? Or if you could just kind of describe the certainty of that and any sort of plan B for the committee, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Chair Dave. I can answer it, but I don't know, Nick, if you want to. But we do address this in the amendment. Basically, what we say is, we're assuming 49% based on our for CIG funding, 49% of the project cost based on our historic experience with that program. And any difference we experience between that assumption and what we actually get or don't get through that program would be made up according to state law, which essentially means that it would fall to Hennepin County to fund that. Nick, I don't know if you want to add anything further.
No, that's correct. And that would be a decision of Hennepin County at that time. Once we do find out the federal share of the project, we'll have to convene with Hennepin County to make a decision on the project.
Thank you.
Thanks. I had maybe one more question about the funding and how it's represented in the TPP. So it looks like some of the operating costs for both of the projects are going to be utilizing the unallocated sales and use tax for the region. And this is just sort of like maybe the minutia of the TPP. In the plan, there are those projections of how much unutilized sales and use tax there is remaining to allocate for the region. Will all of that information be updated, or is that too fine of a detail just as projects and project costs change and we can't update the plan every time that happens? Or do we try to update it when we have a corresponding TPP amendment that does affect the overall financial picture for a regional funding source?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Chair. Our approach for this amendment was to state our expected net impact from each of these projects. We have a few moving pieces as far as the total impact to the unallocated sales tax, or I think what we call that, the opportunity fund or something like that. With Riverview being taken out of the fiscally constrained plan, that those funds were then freed up. And so there's multiple things happening, so that's why we stuck with just stating the net impact we expect from these projects in the amendment, because that was kind of a moving piece at the same time. I don't know if that adequately answers your question, but I see Cole has his hand up as well.
It makes sense,
Yeah,
but go
just-
ahead, Cole.
Was just going to add that we don't try to revisit the entire finance assumptions, because then you have to revisit inflationary assumptions. You have to kind of look at the current revenue rates and all that. So we're just giving you, I think, the relative impact to the existing TPP, if that makes sense. And it's an interesting question, Gina. I think if it was a larger programmatic amendment, we might consider, if it was like 10 or 15 different investments, we might consider looking at all of those. But for the 2 corridors, it just didn't seem like worth the effort to redo the entire financial plan, which is a big effort. So, but good feedback. I think it's a good question for this group of how often should we do that? And we would generally revisit it if there's a significant revenue change too, if there's like a new revenue source that was created. But in this case, it was just the change in the cost of the project. So, but something we can noodle over for future amendments, depending on their scope.
I imagine it's a slippery slope that if you do that for one project, you're doing it for many. So I was just curious, and I know I haven't been paying attention to current legislative efforts, but people were eyeing that money for other things, and so didn't know if it made sense to amend the overall estimate in the TPP. And I don't remember the magnitude of that underutilized fund to know how much of a impact these 2 projects have on it, but
Right.
they look like big dollars.
Yeah.
I was going to see if Amy wanted to weigh in, because there isn't also an annual financial report that I think might answer some of those questions. So maybe, Amy, that's what you're going to mention.
Yeah, just to clarify, the impact of the Riverview being removed, we got that in time for the final plan. It probably was after TAC Planning had done most of its review. But the current unallocated sales tax funding in the TPP was 2.3 billion over the 26-year period, and it comes in up and down. Most of it comes in the earlier years as we're building out the system. And so the impact of this amendment, I think, Bradley, the total impact was 400 million. Was that correct?
Somewhere around there, yeah.
Yeah. So conceivably, if nothing else had changed, the 2.3 is now down to 1.9 or 1.8 in there. Of course, what we know since then is the sales tax funds in general have been coming in lower than expected. And as Cole said, you have all these other simultaneous changes happening. So what will happen at this point is we'll get a new, also we're going to lose our general fund, likely under the proposed bills in both the Senate and the House. So we'll have the legislative session conclude this year, and then next fall, the council will produce a transit financial analysis report that looks at the overall system funding, and that will get updated given all the new assumptions. That is just a 10-year period, which is actually a little bit more accurate because looking out 26 years is just a long time frame. But anyway, long way of saying that'll be the next point, next late October, November, where we'll have an update on what the whole system looks like and projecting out for 10 years if there's any revenue still unallocated.
Thanks, that's helpful context. And I didn't mean to take us into the weeds there, but I was just, I was curious. Any other comments or questions? Okay, we have a proposed motion from staff or action, I guess, which is, I'll read it, that the draft 2050 TPP Amendment 1, changing the alignment and funding for the Blue Line Extension Transitway and adding the Gold Line Extension Transitway to the fiscally constrained plan be released for public comment. Do we have a motion on the requested action?
This is Dave from MTS Planning. I will make that motion.
All right, thanks, Dave. And do
Second,
we have a
this is
second?
Anton Jervy.
Anton, did you get that first? I think so.
Barely.
I couldn't hear who was trying to beat you to the punch, so I will go with Anton as the second. And this is also a roll call vote, I believe. Correct, Jed?
Yes, we do need a call for final discussion, though.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Any additional discussion? Okay, hearing none, I will ask Jed to take the roll call vote.
Jorge Bernal,
Aye.
Dan Ruiz, Drew Flummer,
Aye.
Charlie Howley,
Aye.
Scott Peters, Dan Patterson,
Aye.
Bridget Reef, Patrick Boylan,
Can you hear me?
Oh, now I can.
Okay.
Is that an aye?
Yes, aye.
Okay. David Burns,
Aye.
Patrick Haney,
Aye.
Amy Barnsdorf. Aye. Gina Medico.
Aye.
Innocent AO. Kevin Roggenbuck.
Aye.
Anton Jervy.
Aye.
John Rudolph.
Aye.
Ethan Buss.
Aye.
Elaine Katsukos.
Aye.
Sarah Allen.
Maddie Dahlheimer for Sarah Allen. Aye.
Sorry. Thank you. Chris Hartzell.
Aye.
And Innocent AO.
Aye.
Chair, there were 17 ayes, no noes, and no abstentions. Motion carries.
All right, thank you. The next, so that concludes our business items. The next items are informational. The next one being the 2050 Regional Aviation System Plan update. And I believe this follows a similar path as the previous one because it is proposed to be a TPP amendment. So we'll hear it this month for information and then next month again for potential public release. So I will turn it over to Joe Whiting, who will lead us through the presentation.
Thank you, Chair Medico. I just want to, we'll see in the schedule coming up after this, but actually we won't be back till July. We have a different airport thing to do next month, so we want to kind of deconflict all the various airport stuff, not overload everybody. So we will come back in July with this. We'll have a little more time to bake on this before we go to public comment, but I will jump in. So yes, today I'll go quick information item. Actually a lot to cover here. So on the 2050 Regional Aviation System Plan, which will be our second TPP amendment. Real quick, while we talk here before we get into the meat of this. So first we'll talk a little bit about our role in regional aviation planning and kind of why we're coming back here for this today. And, you know, obviously the plan that got adopted a couple months ago, but come back for the aviation system plan. Then we'll move to kind of how we're looking to better connect the plan to our regional development guide and our policies for the aviation system. Then we'll move on to some key industry trends and takeaways that we've been developing through this update process to kind of inform our looking to the future. Then we'll actually go through some high level of what those changes are contemplated being made in the plan. And also obviously connected to this, we did release a redlined draft with this as well. That's got more of the details in there if you really want to dive in, but we'll kind of touch on that in there before we go to next steps. But yes, so real quick before we go into why we're what we're doing here, but why we're here. So unlike our surface transportation system, the regional aviation system is outlined and defined and required for us to really look at the Met Council in Minnesota state statute. This outlines the Met Council to prepare what is known as Regional Aviation System Plan, which is now within the Transportation Policy Plan. And additionally, it requires regional airports to produce and update their long-term comprehensive plans, similar to our community long-term comprehensive plans. And then also on top of that, the Met Council, similar to those community comprehensive plans, must review and determine if airport plans conform to the regional system and are consistent with the regional policy. So that's something that we do. We'll get there next month with the Flying Cloud plan, but that's kind of what we do. That system plan kind of sets us up. Then we review those local airport plans kind of in line with that, and similar to how we do with our city comprehensive plans. Additional to that, the council must review the Metropolitan Airport Commission's capital improvement plan every year. It would come back every January or so to do that, and then review other approved major capital projects that have any significant effects on the orderly or economic development of the region. One thing we don't do, as opposed to our federal surface transportation, is we do not provide or allocate direct funding for aviation. So this is merely a policy plan and not necessarily an investment plan like you see in those other areas of transportation. As I mentioned again, so that the TPP again is that region's full long-range transportation plan, which is a federally required element for our surface transportation and investments, but then also is that then the state required system plan for aviation. And so we are coming back here now because we don't have those hard deadlines with that federal system. We had to get that adopted in February this year, but the state requirements don't actually require us to have any timelines or things like that for the aviation plan. So we were able to take a little more time with that and come back with this amendment to the TPP. Part of that work was looking at our regional goals as they're reset up and kind of thinking about how that aviation system policies and actions can better fit with those regional goals that they've been identified in the regional development guide. I won't read these out, but we've got those 5 key goals: our region is equitable, inclusive, our communities are healthy and safe, our region is dynamic and resilient, we lead on addressing climate change, and we protect and restore natural systems. So what we did over the last couple months, starting last fall and into this winter, we looked to get some teams together, some stakeholders from both our industry partners and also our local partners to help us review the policies and actions for the regional aviation system plan. So this process was very similar to if you were involved in the overall TPP policy and action development a couple of years ago. It was very similar to that process where we established 2 teams. Again, one was consistent of representatives from local communities and adjacent to regional airports, and then the other teams represented Metropolitan Airports Commission, MnDOT, Aeronautics, FAA folks, other airport operators like Delta, and other industry stakeholders as well. We held 3 meetings with both these teams. The first meeting was to review the existing policies as they were drafted and moved through. The second meeting was really to look and draft, review, and updated policies. And finally, that third meeting was looking to draft and review supporting actions and have discussions around that. In addition, I was invited to multiple industry groups in the region and also a couple communities in the region to bring this information to those specific areas and have discussions with them on what we're thinking for the regional aviation system as well. So lots of meetings going on the last couple of months here, and really all that was to get us to kind of establishing or reestablishing our regional aviation system policies and actions, and potentially any new ones. I won't read these out. Again, it's in that full document there with also that full list of actions. There's going to be 10 policies here and about 38 or 39 related actions under those policies. Majority of these actions and policies are not new. They're mainly, we looked at them, we edited them, we updated them to better fit with our regional goals, but they aren't new policies per se, just looking to update them and really look at these and give these a hard look. So only you see here that new policy here, something that we all are thinking about and dealing with is thinking about those GHG emissions. So just like surface transportation in the state, non-surface transportation, which includes aviation, also has GHG reduction targets. So we wanted to work that into our policies as well as we think about GHG and other emission reductions at our regional airports. That's a policy 4 specific there. Looking at region dynamic and resilient goal area, we have 2 new policies here, which one looking at just ensuring that our regional system is up to date and coordinated with our federal and state systems as well. We'll see how that connects later on, but that's something we want to really enshrine in policy here to ensure that, as we work on these plans, we are ensuring that they are updated every time and that they're still meeting those federal and state as well. Then finally, also looking to the futures, policy 8, where we'll talk more about where this came from, but thinking about those aviation activities that may soon be taking place, not necessarily at our regional airports. Think of drones, think of other sorts of flying machines that could be flying that don't necessarily need an airport to fly. So we want to be looking to the future as well with that policy, to be thinking about some of those things as we come to the future as well. These last two goals are, again, those not new ones here. And as I mentioned, again, there's a full list of the corresponding actions found in that supporting aviation information section that is included with this presentation. Now I'm going to go into some of these emerging issues and opportunities that we were researching through the last couple of months and have papers with. So this is a big part of the update here, and thinking about our policies and actions, and think about those future kind of what's the system going to look like in the future. We produced 6 different papers here, one on aviation fuels and alternative power sources, one on what's known as advanced air mobility, one on unmanned aerial systems, UAS drones, one on airport classifications, one on aircraft noise, and then also an update on the FAA, MnDOT, and industry changes anticipating over the next couple of years here. Those full papers are on the website, on the Aviation Plan website. I won't click it here and jump in there, but they're all there. They're about 8 to 10 pages each, so I don't want to obviously have them in this presentation here, but they're all very interesting information. So if you want to go check those out, they're all going to be right there as well. I will give a little summary on some of these key ones that are really, I think, be driving impacts and changes in the industry over the next couple of years here. And then again, those full papers are on the website. So our first one here is aviation fuels and alternative power sources. So this is one kind of connected to the GHG reduction, but also efficiency and other issues that we see in the aviation industry. First one here is sustainable aviation fuel. I'm sure some of you might have heard news of Greater MSP, Delta, and our MSP airport kind of partnering to do what's known as sustainable aviation fuel. So essentially, this is not traditional jet fuel that you derive from oil and fossil fuels. This is something that would be derived from bio sources like food waste and other things like that that's grown in the state. And so Greater MSP and Delta have thought of this as a great opportunity to create a sustainable aviation fuel hub in the region and state to grow the fuel in our state, process it, and then actually fly airplanes out of MSP using it. So you can see here, Delta's got some pretty aggressive targets for SAF in the region and looking to have up to 50% of their planes be utilizing SAF by 2035, so in 10 years. So that's a pretty aggressive change there. The airport goes through hundreds of millions of gallons of aviation fuel every year. And so thinking about how to switch this over to a brand new fuel source is going to take a lot of effort, coordinated effort in the region and state, but there are things happening to make that happen. Again, I mentioned the Greater MSP, but also the state has also done has created some tax breaks and tax incentives for these fuels to be developed in state. And it's something that, as we think about those GHG emissions too, so this doesn't necessarily reduce those tailpipe emissions, right? So that jet aircraft is still burning fuel. However, how that fuel is derived through the process is definitely going to be helping us reach our GHG targets overall from many industries in the region, not just from our transportation sector. On the flip side here, this is something looking more at the past and what this will look like in the future is, you may not know this, but we phased out leaded gas in motor vehicles, I think in the mid-70s. However, leaded aviation gas is still used in all piston aircraft that fly in the region and the country. So anytime you see an airplane with a propeller flying there, it's using leaded aviation fuel, and so the majority of those small utilize that fuel and need to use that for purposes of safe flying on those vehicles. But it's really the last source of lead in the environment from burning it, and there are initiatives to get this fuel phased out. There are new fuels that are being developed that are unleaded versions of the leaded fuels we see today in aircraft. We also have additional information that a recent study by the EPA. Lead at any level is unsafe in the environment, and so as we think about how to limit that in our airports too, that's something we're looking to be pushing for and hopefully get to eliminating that in the future. Another thing we note too is the FAA is requiring leaded fuel to be used till 2030 at least. So in the last FAA Authorization Act, they actually put that in the bill that you cannot ban or reduce use of leaded fuel until 2030 at least. However, there are multiple states, cities, counties in the country that plan to, once that kind of moratorium is ended in 2030, to begin to push and phase out leaded fuel in their own local airports. Places like California and Colorado are looking at this as well. And we were looking to incorporate some language into our actions in the region to encourage this transition when feasible in the region. Looking back to the future here, this is another area where, again, we're looking at those GHG emission reductions. Other impacts from aviation is electric aircraft. So similar to EV cars, there is a big push to electrify certain types of aircraft in the industry. And so really the electric aircraft is something we're seeing kind of in those small all electric are being designed and manufactured for that general aviation industry with pilot training in mind specifically. Pilot train doesn't need to really go that far. You kind of stay by the airport and kind of run all day. So it's kind of a perfect area where we can potentially see some electrification of our aviation fleet as well in the region. Connected to this, MnDOT Aeronautics is currently conducting and wrapping up what they're calling their MEAN plan, which is the Minnesota Electric Aviation Network Plan. We're looking to incorporate those findings into our plan to help to get the momentum to start electrifying some of our smaller aircraft. As I mentioned, those GHG reduction targets, again, obviously flying electric aircraft will aid the aviation industry in meeting those targets for 2050. And we'll be looking to incorporate some thinking in the plan to that effect as well. Going on to our next trend here. So the next trend we're looking at is unmanned aerial systems, UAS, drones, more commonly known. So UAS is really the fastest growing segment of aviation in the United States, in the world, right? We see drones more and more and more every day. I just looking at the Minnesota state transportation bills, and there's a bill about drone flights for entertainment purposes, right? So there's drone stuff that's going to be going. We're going to see a lot more drones in the near future, and it's something that we should be tracking at the regional level as well. Some of these other big sectors we're anticipating seeing drone use in the near future is logistics and shipping. Think delivering packages or things like that in the region. And as we look forward to when that is potentially going to be unlocked, there's something called beyond visual line of sight operations. So today, if you're flying a drone, you must be able to see it with your eyes to be able to legally operate it by FAA rules. However, the FAA in the Reauthorization Act of last year has been tasked with creating rules and regulations to allow for those drones to be able to be flown beyond someone's visual line of sight, which will then unlock kind of those drone deliveries and things like that. Whereas someone doesn't need to see the drone to fly it, they then can fly it from, say, a room in a building or something else like that, right? So this is likely something we'll see changing in the next year or two, and something that will potentially unlock drone use in the country, in the region specifically. And kind of connect to that, how we think about in the region. So the FAA has developed a lot of different frameworks for drone operation and use in the country. And part of their Part 107 frameworks established the rules for the safe operations of UAS in the National Airspace System. And in 2017, they developed what's known as the LANT system. Is right here, low altitude authorization and notification capability. So what essentially is if if there's a towered airport, that would be MSP, downtown St. Paul, Flying Cloud, Indian Prairie, Anoka Blaine and Crystal in Crystal. Those tower airports have these kind of grid-based mapping around them that if you're flying a drone, you cannot fly it above the heights that you see in these little squares. You see 400 here. So that means if you're flying a drone, you couldn't go over 400 feet within the distance from MSP. And so as we're thinking about potential drone delivery operations, drone use, things like that, these maps will become more and more important as, say you're an Amazon and you're looking to put a warehouse somewhere, right? And you're looking to deliver drones from that warehouse. You might not want to locate next to MSP because you might not be able to fly those drones at all, right? So this is something we're looking to incorporate into the plan as well to provide our local partners with some more information as they maybe start getting these in the future, is thinking about, if you do have someone who's looking to use drones from a facility, you should be considering, how close to your airports you are and if you in fact can actually fly those drones. And so something that, again, we'll be probably learning more about as we go in the future, but another very interesting trend that we're seeing. Another one similar to drones, but in a different kind of size ball game here is what's known as advanced air mobility or urban air mobility. So as we see advancing technology in our growing urban areas and the need to reduce those GHG emissions, has really been leading some of our aircraft developers to think of innovative new methods for transportation to get people around our regions and country. AAM is really our aircraft designed for VTOL, which is vertical takeoff and liftoff operations from designated vertiports. So vertiports are something that are being developed by the FAA, which would be something similar to a heliport or an airport in combination. So it'll have facilities. You go to a terminal similar to an airport, but then you'd fly out with a VTOL craft like a heliport. So they're kind of these build these facilities that can combine commercial operations with more helicopter-like type operations. So again, as mentioned, FAA is developing frameworks for these developments in the country. We're potentially anticipating AAM uses to include passengers, so you potentially could be flying from one side of the region to the other, and also smaller freight and logistics operations within and between urban areas. We are potentially seeing multiple aircraft in this realm be certified by the FAA for commercial operations, potentially by 2027. So something in the near future, again, that we should be considering at the regional level, as these kind of vehicles will kind of transcend city boundaries as they fly and hop around between our cities and regions. So I mentioned FAA has released some interim guidance on vertiport design, and also that FAA Reauthorization Act said a lot. Another thing it talks about is directing the agency to publish final design this year. So there'll be final designs from the FAA released this year, and that's something at the regional level we can help to translate for local partners if you ever do hear of a vertiport sniffing around your community. But as we think about this, right, we're looking to proactively integrate AAM into our national airspace system, and also as we think about more at the local level, thinking about zoning and land use integration with potential vertiports, thinking about the state level where that more policy and development considerations, at the federal level more of those airspace regulations. How will these vehicles move around our communities? How will we then integrate them into our surface transportation system and our local land use policies? In the paper, you'll see there's a couple cities in the country that are already developing zoning ordinances about vertiports. Specifically, Orlando is one of the more notable ones, as they have a vertiport zoning ordinance. We're seeing some places in Florida and California actually start to see these kind of vertiports pop out, and they aren't flying these new VTOL crafts. They're still flying helicopters, but they're preparing to be able to fly these new crafts as soon as they're ready. So this is something that's happening quickly. A lot of this new technology, I think, is going faster than a lot of people have anticipated. So something we're tracking here at the regional level as well. Something not so new, and something that I think everyone's aware of, is aircraft noise. Another issue that we're continually tracking, and something that our airport partners work with our local communities to mitigate for their residents. Early aircraft noise, that unwanted sound resulting from aircraft operations, and it's considered one of the more harmful environmental impacts from aviation, and really one of the main contributing factors why there's a lot of negative community response to operations at regional airports. The FAA regulation industry changes connected to this so in 2016, the FAA has implemented regulations prohibiting the operation of older, noisy aircraft in the U.S. So think of those really old regional jets that you heard rocketing over if you live in Minneapolis or St. Paul for many, many years. COVID actually helped to speed up that transition, as a lot of those aircraft were retired during COVID and will not come back to operation. So we're seeing actually a pretty steady improvement in noise impacts in the region, at least if it becomes MSP. And so that's something that's a positive trend. Additionally, there's also advancements in satellite and other sort of navigation that has allowed FAA to implement more dispersed instrument procedures. So also something you might have heard recently was what's called the RNAV process at MSP, which is essentially to turn our flight tracking software to a satellite-based software to allow then for more direct and precise aircraft routing from our FAA towers. So the FAA is working with the MAC and other regional aviation partners to improve those operations at our airport, and also to then better disperse flights and to hopefully reduce impacts to certain areas of our region. One more note on noise. This is also something the FAA is developing updated standards for. So the civil aviation noise policy is what drives a lot of those mitigation and other efforts for noise impacts. And the FAA is currently working on updating that policy, and as well as their planning advisory circular. So once those are updated and the FAA's those are official final rules, we'll then have to come back at the regional level to update what we have as our builder's guide for aircraft noise mitigation, and that is directly connected to the FAA noise policies. And so we're tracking those as well, and that'll be another item probably coming up the next couple of years that we'll have to update for the aviation side. So those are really the big trends that we're tracking kind of in the aviation industry. And now we're going to move into what actually some of these changes are in the plan itself to relate to that. So here's our regional system. So our regional system for airports is really mature, and there really isn't many changes we're anticipating for our airports specifically. We've got 9 airports in the region. We've got MSP as our major airport. We've got 8 relievers to MSP, 6 of those owned by the MAC, and 2 of those owned by their local communities, Forest Lake and South St. Paul. Also 2 seaplane bases. So that's out there in Inver Grove and up there in Lino Lakes. So as I mentioned, all these facilities are protected to meet their forecast demand, and we don't really anticipate many issues with the airports themselves. It's more of those kind of expanding our considerations of where aviation can and does operate in the region. I think as we think about this as a holistic system. So as part of the update here, we added additional aviation facilities that are not in the regional system, but are operating aviation in the region and are now identified in the plan. As you see here, we've got helipads, private turf runways, agricultural use runways, and then certain lakes and rivers. So if you got a lake big enough, someone could land a plane on it. So something to know, right? If you live on a lake, someone might land a plane on it if it's big enough. So that's why we've got some of these on here too. So just note here, just as you're thinking about those local planning practices, and thinking about development, that just because you're not next to an airport doesn't mean there might not be aviation activity occurring near where you're at, right? So this hopefully will help in those considerations as well, and kind of, oh, what's that noise? Why am I hearing noise? Well, you might be next to a helipad or a private airfield. A big part of this plan, as I mentioned with one of our papers, was airport classifications. So airport classifications is similar to a roadway functional classification, is looking at how those airports operate in the system, what are they doing, and what's their classification based upon their regional roles. So identifying airports' role in the system, its infrastructure needs, facility improvements, airspace integration, environmental impacts, noise mitigation, requires a classification framework to prioritize those investments and the improvements. So FAA, MnDOT, and at the Metropolitan Council, we all have our own classification systems. The FAA is known as the NIPIAS, or the National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems. You have to be on the NIPIAS to be eligible for federal funding. At MnDOT's level, they have their Minnesota State Aviation System Plan, and they also classify airports in their plan. Then also we are tasked with the role of classifying airports with the regional plan as well. Noted here, 8 of the 9 regional airports, so every airport but Forest Lake is eligible for NIPIAS as a federal classification. And this here is just a general classification map of the existing classifications. So the aviation system, as I mentioned, has those 3 distinct classifications. The table here kind of compares the 3 classifications for each of our regional airports and kind of how they differ. As you can see here, our reliever airports, that's St. Paul down, have a little more distinction at the federal and state level. So in our paper here to look at this, we really want to go in and drill down and understand, is there any sort of additional nuance we can provide for our regional partners, understanding what's actually going on at their airports in their region or in their city. So one thing we kind of drilled down in this paper is we found out the existing classification system was established in 1977 and essentially hasn't changed since then. So those minor airports, intermediate airport, major airport have been the same for almost 50 years now. So a long time to not really have much updates on these. We also noted that the last review of the system was done for the 2030 TPP, so that's almost 20 years ago now. And there was additional recommendations with that update, but those were never adopted. I couldn't really find out why they weren't adopted, but they were not adopted. And so we wanted to come back and say, well, is there changes we can do to at least better identify these airports in the region? One very key note here for regional airports is state law does dictate that minor airports must have runways at a maximum of 5,000 feet, and they cannot build runways above 5,000 feet to upgrade to an intermediate unless state law allows it. So that's a big clear dividing line between minor airports and everything else, those bigger airports, and one that obviously we can't change with a plan. That would need to be something that updates with state law. One other note, MnDOT Aeronautics did overhaul their state classifications quite a bit in 2022, and so we want to look at these and align them better with our federal and state partners. So we are looking to update these classifications a little bit in the region. So state statute again restricts those minor airports from upgrading to intermediate or expanding, but it does not restrict how the minor classification is defined otherwise. So we can define outside of that 5,000 foot runway limit, we can look at some of these other features of airports and understand what they're actually doing in the regional system. So we're looking to update the classification criteria to better understand and communicate the role of those reliever airports, those minor airports, and looking to better align with the state and federal classifications. So we're proposing to split the minor classification into what we're calling minor primary, so primary relievers, and minor secondary or secondary relievers in the region to MSP. So minor primary will be Flying Cloud and Anoka Blaine, and really what that split is really communicating to us in the region is that Flying Cloud and Anoka Blaine are generally just have different operations than those other regional relievers. They have a lot of business jet activity. So Flying Cloud is one of our business jet hubs, and Anoka Blaine's the other one, with those additional enhanced facilities and those certain needs and impacts to our regional communities. And so by upgrading them to what we're calling a minor primary, we're communicating better that this is actually these airports we're expecting more jet travel at. We're expecting more intense and larger facilities than what we'd see at some of those smaller airports, which are mostly those piston aircraft that are doing training and other recreational flying rather than those more business need flying. Part of this update too, we're looking to further update our forecasts for our airports, and so we will be integrating MSP's forecasts and Flying Cloud's new forecasts into this plan as well. As you can see here, operations at MSP will continue to trail enplanements from aircraft operators, fly less operations with larger planes. So what that means is we're really seeing MSP move more people with less planes, which is good for noise, good for emissions, good for a lot of impacts from there and all the way into the future. It's again, a lot of those smaller planes are being retired, larger quieter planes are being flown and used. We do not expect any capacity issues for the runways at MSP. There is some terminal expansions we're expecting, and we are seeing those already happen at Terminal 2, but the runways and the actual airfield itself is not going to see any sort of capacity issues through 2050. General aviation is beginning to grow since COVID. We saw quite of a long-term decline of general aviation traffic at our reliever airport since about the early 2000s, but we actually have been starting to see some growth in the last couple of years, and we're expecting that to be sustained, but pretty low for throughout the planning horizon. As I mentioned, forecasts have been updated to 2050 for all of our regional airports. Finally, I want to talk about the planning process a little bit here. So this is a planning process for aviation is a little different than we have for our surface transportation, as the federal government is highly involved with aviation. They require a lot of environmental reviews for a lot of aviation related projects at airports, and also we have that capital improvement plan requirement that is reviewed and approved by the council as well. So as you can see here, this kind of outlines the cycle of planning in the region. I do want to talk quick about long-term comprehensive plans specifically. So as I mentioned earlier, those long-term comprehensive plans at airports are a major component of the aviation systems plan, and also something you can think similar to how you do for a citywide community comprehensive plan. Is something that updates your local, your partners and your adjacent neighbors about what's happening in your city or the supported airport through the planning horizon. Planning documents for airports which identify projected aircraft activity, high-level impacts, and phase facility needs. So if you look at those plans, you'll see they've usually got 3 phases: a short-term, medium-term, long-term improvements plan there. MSP plan was approved in 2024, and that is incorporated into the TPP. And Flying Cloud, which we'll look at next month, will be reviewed this year and incorporated into this update as well. So we're it's not final yet, but we're working those draft figures into this TPP as well to be sure we've got those into it as we update this. We have looked at those long-term comprehensive plan requirements that exist in the actual document itself. Per feedback we've heard from our industry partners and from our community partners on the review process to hopefully better align with community desires and the reality of long-term airport planning. So airport planning takes a long time. Creating these plans for each airport takes a couple years. And after that, then they must be then approved by the FAA. They must then go into environmental review document phase. Then they must then be put in the capital improvement plan before a project actually gets built. So looking to align these expectations for plan development timelines with those community comprehensive plan requirements. So every 10 years. Previously, this requirement was every 5 years. However, I've learned through many discussions with airport partners that updating a plan every 5 years just doesn't make a ton of sense, because you probably won't even have any projects from the first plan by the 5-year update period. So moving this a little further, 10 years, ensures that these plans can be updated regularly, and they will be updated on time. And then also then that these updates will be substantial, and actually we can learn new things from these updates. And it allows these airports to update their plans, then move those projects into that environmental review process and then into that capital improvement plan as well before coming in for another plan update. We're also looking to more clearly identify when expected environmental considerations be reviewed and addressed in this process. So as I mentioned, the federal government's a lot more engaged in the planning process with airports and other areas. And so we're looking to, there's some requirements that we previously required in the long-term plan that is actually done during environmental reviews. So things like groundwater and the water supply and things like that any projects could potentially impact. we're just aligning those expectations when we expect to see those. And so an environmental review process is a lot more relevant for a lot of these projects, as comprehensive plans are very conceptual and aren't actually proposing to build projects until we actually go through that environmental review phase. Additionally, the last kind of big aspect of the plan is that land use compatibility. So if you live next to airports like MSP here, you obviously have that aircraft noise is a big consideration for land use considerations. The Met Council, as I mentioned earlier, contains or maintains the builder's guide for mitigating aircraft noise. Those mitigation measures will not change yet, but as those FAA documentation and policies are updated, we will look to update our documents as well to meet those. However, we do now include these standardized exposure maps with existing land use, generalized land use from our own data with those MAC and other airport noise impact contours, and we are updating all these contours as much as we can. So we've got MSPs updated 2040, we'll have flying clouds updated 2040, and we'll continue to update these when those contours come in effect. And as I mentioned, the plan also includes those other aviation areas. So, you might have a helipad next to you. You should be considering about that if you want to live there. So those are the big kind of changes we're looking at here in our plan. Again, nothing on the actual regional system. Those airports aren't going anywhere, but we are hopefully better identifying them in that system so our partners can know what's actually going on at these airports and update key information in the plan. We're keen to make final edits, so I'll be meeting with MnDOT next week about that mean study to actually look to incorporate that in the plans. There's going to be key items we haven't updated yet. You'll see those in the next time I'm back here in a couple months, but just to let you know, there's still work on that plan, so on that Redline document you got today. So as I mentioned, this will be an information item, TAC Planning. We'll go through the process, the Transportation Committee in end of June. Then we'll come back in a couple months, not next month, to have the action item to release for public comment. With that said, I took about a little longer than I thought I was going to, but any questions, I will feel free to ask them.
All right, thanks, Joe. That was a lot of information. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions about all that? Or comments? Charles or Charlie.
Thank you, Chair. No questions. Just want to say nice job. I learned a lot. This is a good presentation. It was great.
If you want to learn more, I could drone on for hours if you want to go on and on.
Enough for one day.
Thanks.
And Amy?
Yeah, and I might have missed this, Joe, but at the beginning, did you talk about the various groups that you partnered with along the way here?
Yeah, I'd have one slide on that, Amy. I can go back to that. In updating those policies and actions, we met with, again, our local communities, either if there's an airport within your community or you're impacted by it. We're trying to reach out and get some feedback from you on those policies and actions and reviewing the plan. MAC, MnDOT, Aeronautics, FAA, other state industry stakeholders. I had Delta representative. I had a few other smaller fixed base operator representatives and Met Council land use staff as well. So tried to cover the bases on every sort of idea here. And I did go out to, as I mentioned, a few other outside meetings. I chatted with some folks. I chatted with the Minnesota Business Aircraft Association. I went to their annual meeting a couple months ago, and I went to Lakeville and a couple other cities to present some findings as well. So trying to get out there as much as possible. Remind people that this exists is the big one too, because I think a lot of people don't realize we do this. So.
Yeah, that's great. And thanks for reminding me. So a lot of you who have been around for a while might remember that in the past we had an aviation group and it never really worked very well. We've had a hard time keeping aviation experts or people who know very much about aviation involved in our processes because it comes up so infrequently. So, it's a lot of effort to be involved in our processes. And if your subject really isn't coming up a lot, it's a lot to ask. And so recently we've really been trying to use other avenues to communicate and get feedback on airport topics, airport issues. So if you've noticed that really is why. that we're trying to keep those most involved and interested in airports in. You have ideas about other ways to interact with your community, let us know on that too.
Anton.
Thanks, Chair. Joe, are drones universally being excluded from airport uses? It seems like that's the trend, or are you seeing anywhere, I guess, nationally that is trying to incorporate drone use, like as part of airport operations? I'm thinking about, like, we've got a lot of pretty urban airports in this region, and I'm thinking about like freight delivery and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'd say with the towered airports here, with especially this LANT system, FAA is going to be very strict about operations around airports. I think one of the things that we've seen as potential, right, drones moving into flight paths and things like that. And so this grid here used to be, or some drone operators, specifically DJI, which is the main big one. They used to have what they used to geofence their software. So if you're flying one and you were within this grid-based system here, you literally couldn't physically move the vehicle beyond that imaginary point. That actually changed in January, and now it is something that it is no longer geofenced in for a lot of drones. And personally, that's something a little concerning, because I think a lot of people who operate drones probably don't know this exists. And so they might get a warning on their little device, but it's not actually going to stop them from flying up or down. I do know the U.S. Marshals have crazy drone technology at the airport that they can detect where someone's flying it and they can go find you. But that requires kind of manual enforcement. And there's only 2 U.S. Marshals at the airport. So I think it's personally a little concerning, but we haven't had any issues yet, knock on wood. But I would say generally they're going to be pretty strict around airports about drone use, for obviously flight path reasons, and just the inability to be able to control everyone from operating their own drone. And so it's my hope is they'll go back soon to the geofencing where they won't let vehicles move any further than those heights. But I think that's something that's a moving target with FAA. But I definitely would assume that something like this will continue on, and you might even start seeing like these almost like aerial highways. I think I had another image in the UA, like this one right here, right, where they'll be designated certain flight paths and certain heights for certain types of vehicles, and that maybe could allow drones through certain corridors in that area to operate. But I think there's still a lot to be discovered here. I think the FAA will be learning a lot more as the FAA starts developing these rules in the next couple of years. But fun stuff, interesting stuff. It's always it's new stuff, so it's good to learn new stuff.
Cool.
Yeah, I know we got an agenda full, so we have to move on. But I just wanted to recognize Joe. You know, he's been here for 2 years, just over 2 years. He became an aviation planner when he started, and you guys can tell he's really, really taken it on and learned a lot. And I think he's a huge resource for not only us, but for the whole region. And the next couple of years of implementing, comprehensive plans and all that's going to be a lot more exciting for folks because they have some fun new issues potentially tackle with helicopter pads and all that. So just a shout out to Joe for doing such a great job and becoming, I would say, a aviation expert in a relatively short period of time.
Opportunities, I'd say, Cole, but thank you. We don't.
I can, I as a sector rep here at the Met Council on Community Development, I can second what Cole just said, and I've had some experiences with Joe in local communities and working with aviation stuff, and so looking forward to going into the 2050 cycle, which I guess we're already in, but hitting it hard later this fall as people get system statements and they start doing their comp plans or starting them as soon as possible. So thanks.
Yeah, you'll be seeing a lot more of me, I think, coming up, in every way, comp plans especially.
All right, sounds like it's needed. I had to Google some terminology I hadn't heard before. So
Yeah,
Thank
it's the
you
problem
for-
with all planning, right? All this stupid acronyms, and it's like I keep going. I'm like, oh, and I got to describe this. I got to describe this.
It wasn't even an acronym. It was one of the, now I forgot already what it was, but it was the helipad.
Vertiport. It's a fun one.
Vertiport, thank
It's a
you.
fun
Yes,
one,
I
yeah.
had never heard of vertiport, but now I feel like we learned something new.
And I didn't mention this in the presentation, but if you're ever looking to see one in Chicago, there is one next to the Costco South Side. So if you're ever looking to see what one looks like in the real world, that's the closest one I think we could find right now.
Hopefully there'll be a budget for this committee to go down there and check it out.
Call the FAA.
All right. Well, yes, thanks, Joe. Appreciate all the information, and we look forward to having you back in 2 months, so in July. Is that correct?
Be back next month with Flying Cloud, and then I'll be back with this again in the next month. I'll be back every month. I'm just here
All
every
right,
month.
sounds good. We will all be aeronautics experts or aviation experts after this. All right, so we do have 2 more information items. It's now 2:10, so we'll try to move this along. The next one is the Regional Bicycle Transportation Network update, evaluation measures with Steve. And if I get bumped off, I'm getting a notification from my computer that something needs to shut down, so I'm trying to close it, but I can't. So hopefully I'll be with you for this. If not, I'll jump back on as soon as I can. So Steve, are you available and ready? Okay, thanks.
I'm available and ready. Yep. Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, committee members. Okay, I didn't share my screen yet. I thought I did. Hang on. No,
we're seeing your screen.
You can see.
We see it.
Sorry. Right. I shared it on a different screen today. So yeah, let me begin with just the purpose of my presentation today is really to inform you of the evaluation measures that we're going to be using to evaluate RBTN update proposals. This will happen in July, and mainly to help you to determine if and where in your bicycle networks you might want to propose an addition or a change to the RBTN network. And so before I dig into the details of the evaluation measures, I just want to run through a couple of quick slides that you saw in my last presentation. No, it's not advancing. Pardon me. I will do it this way. And back in March, I did come to you and to talk about the process of the RBTN. I also wanted to mention the Regional Bicycle Barriers update process, which is running parallel to the RBTN process. This is our general timeline here. And we did post to our webpage the RBTN Regional Bike Barriers process on Tuesday, and then widely distributed the public notification by email yesterday. And the deadline you'll have to submit your proposal request is the end of the day, June 30th. And briefly here for regional bike barriers, you have the option to propose adding a new regional bicycle barrier that's consistent with the definitions that we're providing in the application, and or you can add a planned bicycle crossing improvement location that crosses a regional bicycle barrier and is not currently included within our prioritized regional bicycle barrier crossing areas, which are shown by the circles on this map. So those are prioritized locations. And if there are new planned locations for improvements to crossings outside of those areas, those would be the ones you want to propose. And then just briefly for the RBTN itself, to remind you, agencies have the option to propose adding a new RBTN corridor or an alignment, or realigning or extending an existing corridor or alignment. So then to get into the measures, some of you will remember that we conducted this RBTN guidelines and measures study. This was completed in 2021 for the purpose of developing quantitative measures to evaluate our RBTN updates. And later that year, we applied these measures to that RBTN, that first major RBTN update process. We had developed multiple measures for 5 measure categories. These include route directness, corridor spacing, proximity to development, social and economic equity, and system connectivity. And we also, just before I dive into more details on each specific measure, we do have these qualifiers or caveats for people who are reviewing using these criteria. None of these, some measures have specific threshold values, which we do not consider to be absolute with respect to an individual RBTN change request. Rather, we will be evaluating each measure independently. And then after we've evaluated each measure, we bring them all together, take a kind of a higher level look to examine within the context of all the other measures. Some measures may not apply to a specific proposed route change due to unique or context-specific circumstances. And also some measures are only case-specific. So those exceptions and cases I will highlight as we move through the specific measures. So the first set of measures is route directness measures. We have 2 measures. The first is destination proximity. And this mainly applies to evaluating shifts or realignments to our corridors or alignments. And what we're doing is really comparing the proximity to our established RBTN regional destinations within a buffered area for the proposed route versus the existing route. So the proposed shifted route versus what is there today. The measure is the net change in the number of regional destinations, the established regional destinations in the TPP bike plan, which have been updated now to include all of our regional transitway stations as well. And we're looking at the number within 1/10 mile buffer for alignments, or a quarter or half mile buffer for corridors, depending on whether you're in the core cities or just outside the core cities. And the preferred impact would be a net zero reduction or an increase, ideally, in the number of nearby regional destinations. The second measure then in this category is the out of direction ratio. This is also applied primarily to evaluate alignment or corridor shifts. What this does is to compare the proposed route versus the existing network route, the distances between the nearest 2 intersecting points. So you can kind of see the diagram on the left there with the shift in red deviating away from the existing RBTN. The measure is a ratio then of the proposed RBTN route to the nearest existing route length with a maximum threshold, preferred maximum threshold of 2.0. And that actually is fairly generous. In our last major update, I think most of the, if not all of the requests met that criterion with no issues. The next set of measures was actually a single measure, corridor spacing measure, known as our buffered corridor method. This one is used across the region, but would really have more of an impact in the analysis of urban and suburban areas where we have a denser RBTN network. And this is really to provide a visual check for spacing gaps and overlaps between adjacent and parallel RBTN corridors through mapping. So it's an excellent way to just see exactly what's going on. What we're doing is applying a buffer that's based on the preferred minimum spacings that were recommended through the study and established in the TPP between RBTN routes, so corridor center line or an alignment, same buffers, but we have specific buffers that we use then for each of these Imagine 2050 community designation designation cities or groups that you can see there on the right. And the preferred result of that analysis is to see no significant overlaps of the buffered route areas, the buffered corridors, with some exceptions. So there are exceptions to where alignments or corridors converge, as they typically do, to connect to urban or suburban job centers or activity centers, or if they divert to follow curves in roads or to avoid obstacles. The next set of measures is proximity to development. This is a density measure, basically. And it's, again, this one is used exclusively in the urban and suburban designated communities. This is a comparison of the proximity to people and jobs along a proposed route compared to and against the minimum preferred densities by Imagine 2050 community designations that you can see there. So those are the recommended thresholds, minimum preferred densities that were established through the study. The measure is the sum of the forecast, which for now is 2050, population plus jobs within half a mile of the proposed RBTN alignment or corridor center line. Yeah, so that's it for that measure. Then we have a second measure in this category called the activity per mile ratio. This is really just a variation on the first measure, but it's used specifically for new additions, so new corridors or new alignments that run through, or extensions, pardon me, that run through rural areas to connect between suburbs or to connect between suburbs and rural centers. The measure is very similar. It's the sum of forecast population plus jobs within half mile of the proposed alignment, and then it's divided by the length of the new route. And so the minimum preferred ratio threshold you see there is 800 population plus jobs per linear mile. So that one's probably the most complex measure we have. There's a lot more details in the original study. Tech Memo 1, I believe it was, that's on our study webpage. It's also linked from the web posting for these updates. So you can find more information there. The fourth group of measures are the social and economic equity measures. We did develop a quantitative measure called access to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and people in poverty communities. This is used only to assess alignment or corridor shifts. We're comparing the population measure of these groups within 1 mile buffered area of the existing RBTN alignment corridor against the proposed route corridor or alignment. The measure is the net change in total BIPOC and below poverty threshold populations within 1 mile of the proposed route. And the preferred threshold result is that RBTN access should be improved, but at a minimum should not be reduced for BIPOC and below poverty populations. The second measure that we have in this category is a qualitative one. It's the only qualitative measure we have. It's the qualitative assessment of benefits to disadvantaged or vulnerable populations. This is done by agencies through the application. They're asked to describe or self-assess what the probable benefits are due to their project or this segment for improving RBTN access for disadvantaged populations with the proposed change. Really, we use this to compare against other similar proposed changes from agencies in a like community designation type. The assessment is a description of the RBTN access benefits to not only BIPOC and people in poverty, but also to immigrant communities, people with disabilities, youth, and senior citizens. And the evaluation impact is that we'll get kind of like bonus points. We get a plus for having positive access benefits to these BIPOC or disadvantaged populations. And where this might come into play is if you're kind of on the cusp or the bubble of being accepted based on the other measures. This could be, if you have a positive outcome here, this could bump it up into the acceptable range. So just something to keep in mind there. And then our last set of measures are, whoops, went too far. Our last set of measures are system connectivity measures. These I would venture to say are the most straightforward measures that we have. We have 4 connectivity measures that are basically the same. The metric is the total number of new direct connections for RBTN alignment or corridor additions, or the net change in the number of direct connections for route shifts. And so really looking to count the number of new direct connections to regional bicycle barrier crossings, new connections to state and regional trails, but specifically regional trails that are not currently on the RBTN. So you're connecting from the RBTN to a regional trail that's not on the RBTN. New connections, sorry about that, new connections to intersections with local bicycle networks, and also new direct connections to for improving continuity to adjacent cities and or county bicycle networks. So that's a lot of information. Those are all the measures and all the details that I can get into about 15 minutes. And so I am happy to entertain any questions you might have, Madam Chair.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, that is a lot of detailed information. So maybe my first question is, did the Bike and Ped work group look at this prior to this group, TAC Planning, or will it go through that group?
It did, yes, it did. We presented to them last month.
Okay, sounds good. Anybody else have any questions or comments? Madeline or Maddie?
Yeah, Chair, thanks. I had a couple of questions. I'm fairly new to getting into the nuance of the RBTN. And I'm just curious about the criteria themselves and how often those inputs are updated. So I know you mentioned the TPP specifically with the proximity to populations measure, but how often are the other criteria, kind of like the back end data, how often is that updated?
So I'm not sure I understand the question. So the background data for the RBTN itself or for one of the measures?
So for all of the different evaluation criteria, all of those quantitative measures is obviously pulling data from somewhere to do this analysis, or the regional destinations might be an easy example of how often are those things being updated so that when we are considering new alignments or extensions or connections, we know what it's being kind of evaluated against.
Well, the way it's, Madam Chair, and thank you for your question, committee member. We have been updating those with each TPP update. And I believe, so that's about the frequency. So about every 5 years. But we've, been adding as we go along. In addition to adding, just as an example, in addition to adding all the regional transit way stations in this TPP, we also added a few from a few years ago that were added conceptually for the Allianz Field in St. Paul and the TCO Stadium, Viking Stadium in Egan. So those were 2 that were added. So, but they generally need to be kind of the same level of regional destinations, which you do have sort of threshold definitions for each of the specific categories.
Mm-hmm. Awesome, thank you. I had one other question.
Yep, go ahead.
Do the regional park implementing agencies get updated on this? I guess I'm not sure if they're kind of mixed into all of these committee groups or if there's a specific outreach effort to make sure all of those entities and departments are engaged. Thinking specifically to your comments about some regional trail connections.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Excellent question. And we are having coordination meetings that are going to begin late this month for every two months. So that type of thing would be given to them as well. They were also included in the wide distribution yesterday for notice, so they're very aware of our processes here as well. I think we've been doing a better job of connecting to them specifically in our TAB and TAC deliberations.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, and thanks, Steve. Appreciate the information. And these, just looking at the schedule, these will not come back to TAC Planning, but they will go through TAC Tab when the applications, after the applications are being reviewed and recommended. Is that correct?
Well, I don't think it's out of the question that we would come to TAC Planning. I guess it depends on timing, but yeah, we could certainly come back with at least an information item if you want to hear the results.
And I'm not suggesting we need to. I was just trying to understand where, if this is the last time you'll see this item or who will, because if I understand right, TAC does not see this detailed item, but it looks like TAC and TAB will be involved in the later phases.
Yeah, well, I think that was meant to identify the full TAC tab process, so we'd probably want to come back here.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, Gina, when we actually do an updated RBTN network for inclusion in the solicitation, we actually do take that piece through TAC Planning, and then the rest of the solicitation goes through F&P.
That's right.
And that's like September, October, I believe, is what we're thinking.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks.
And back to the agenda, we have one final item, and that is the Unified Planning Work Program preview. And again, this will be an information item, and I believe that this will be coming back to us at a future date for more formal review. Amy, are you going to lead, or Jed?
I'm going to start this presentation off and then hand it off to Amy midway through, if that's all right.
Sounds good. Go ahead.
Okay. So we're here today with a preview of the 2026 Unified Planning Work Program. I will be providing an overview of what the UPWP is, some updates on our 2025 studies, those studies that we're considering for 2026. And then at your own pace, there are description slides at the end of the slide deck posted on the agenda that we won't go through today, but are available for you. So this committee is generally pretty familiar with the UPWP. It's our annual plan of federally funded and council-involved transportation planning activities. It describes that for the calendar year, and it also serves as our application for our federal planning funds. The work plan includes the description of each of these studies, their titles, their schedules, costs, deliverables, and it also includes partner-led studies that include Met Council staff. Our timeline for developing the 2026 UPWP, at least as we're engaging with the committee, starts here in May, gathering input on our study needs and preparing the draft document. In June, we will return for TAC Planning's review and considering its recommendation of its release for public comment. It's also reviewed by FHWA and MnDOT at that time. In August, TAC and TAB will review and recommend the UPWP for adoption, continuing on into September for the Council and its Transportation Committee. And in October, we owe an adopted copy to MnDOT and FHWA for their approval. Our goal here today is to share information with you about this process and also to discuss those opportunities and needs that we have for 2026 and beyond. To talk about the 25 studies, I'm going to start off with those studies that began before 2025. The 26 UPWP will include a good chunk of these because they'll continue on even further into 2026. Those include the solicitation evaluation, the highway system harms study, the CMP handbook pilot project. This fourth one here, transportation research program, that includes things like the Access Across America pooled funds study, as well as a task for some short-term research needs with CTS, the evaluation of forecast accuracy and robustness. And we have one project that's continuing into 25, but will wrap this year, the Regional Transportation and Climate Change Multimodal Measures Studies. We also include some locally funded studies. All three of these that continued into 25 are wrapping this year: the Midtown Greenway Planning Project, the Regional Aviation System Plan update that you just heard about earlier, and the equity evaluation of regional transportation investment processes. We have a few projects that are getting underway in 2025. These are the ones that have made progress. They're either in procurement or under contract already. The Microtransit Policy Framework, the Transit Human Services Coordinated Plan, the EV Public Charging Needs Analysis, the first phase of our Sidewalk Dataset Study, and a master contract for outreach and engagement services, and the Pedestrian Bicycle Demand Estimation Tool. Upcoming in 2025, carrying into next year, but they're either still in scope development or under review for a variety of reasons. That could include ensuring compliance with federal orders or changes to regional priorities or some efficiencies to pursue these alongside other tasks. The Activity Sim Phase 3 project, dovetailing off of the Equity Evaluation project wrapping this year. We have the Community Assessment and Engagement Guide and an Equity Evaluation Framework and Tool Training task. An EV Public Engagement and City Support contract, framework for access to public health destinations analysis, GHG strategy development, the Highway System Optimization Study, integrating TDM in highway project development, safer connections with transit, and the second phase of the Sidewalk Dataset Study. We have a few studies that are under consideration for inclusion into 2026, but just to preface this with a few considerations that we have, many of our 2025 projects still have significant carryover budgets, so that could constrain what we are able to do in 2026, as well as our staff capacity to manage those projects and to advance some of the larger important projects like the regional solicitation evaluation. We have a number of tasks related to implementing the 2050 Transportation Policy Plan, and some of that technical assistance work might be a bit more timely since they can relate to the 2050 cycle of comprehensive plans. And of course, we do have some ongoing questions about changes to federal guidance. I'll take the first few of these here and then hand it off to Amy midway through. So the first one here is the Complete Streets Local Implementation Guide. This one is detailed a bit more in the TPP work program with a longer description of it, but it is primarily to provide some technical assistance and guidance, responding to some increased design flexibility offered in the latest surface transportation authorization, as well as some recommendations for how we can integrate Complete Streets into our project selection processes. We plan to do a bit more engagement on this project scope, and I'll be the PM for this project, so the committee can direct questions to me on that. I think Joe Whiting slightly mentioned this one in his aviation system plan presentation, but we also have work to develop tools and guides for the 2050 cycle of local comprehensive plans. He'll be the point of contact on that study. We have a number of tasks related to the regional model, including improving the way that our regional model calculates speed, a contract with an on-call vendor to make software improvements to our network software, and an update to the freight model to incorporate the latest urban freight study findings. And finally, before I pass it off here, the greenhouse gas strategy, greenhouse gas reduction strategy development to build upon some existing tools that we have and reduction strategies for local governments. This is also identified in the 2050 Transportation Policy Plan work program with some further description. Amy.
Yeah, sure. Before I jump into a couple more studies here, I wanted to go back to the budget issue. So typically over the past 3 to 4 years, we have been spending about $1.8 to $2 million a year on these studies. Typically what we would call our consultant studies. So that doesn't cover any of our staff salaries or benefits or other staff items. So the balancing act for the end of this year into 26 and then into future years is really trying to keep a somewhat continuous level of spending around that range of $2 million a year. And we have a number of projects that Jed covered that are yet to kick off this year. And we're now starting to scope them. We're having some debate whether they're still priorities, whether they fit into our budget. And so a couple of the ones I wanted to call attention to, one of them that we really did not include in this 2025 UPWP, but needs to become a priority is the assistance and technical assistance to local governments in the comp planning process. And so that is something we do want to fund. It's a higher priority. And one of the realizations within that is one of the areas that cities need support is in climate reduction. We have some new state statute on including inventories in local comprehensive plans, listing tools and actions that local governments should take. And so we are starting now internally to think about, okay, what does that mean? What should we be doing to provide technical assistance to local governments throughout the comp planning process? So that study area is somewhat climate, it's somewhat climate strategies and tools. And we could, any advice or feedback you have on your needs in that area is very welcome. And Jed, if you want to go forward again. So the study we had, greenhouse gas reduction strategy development, that is the one that is kind of getting rescoped to be more towards technical assistance to local governments in the comp planning process. So it might show up a little bit differently in the 26 UPWP than it's described in the 2025 UPWP. So that one, we're rethinking the major focus of that really. And then if you move to the next slide, we also are in the process of talking with MnDOT. We have 4 projects that we're trying to get an idea of MnDOT's priorities. We would like some feedback today from yourselves, or if you want to give it to us in writing, that would be welcome. We can't do all of these projects. We don't have the staff or budget for them. So we're trying to get an idea of priorities. So this first study, Arterial Modernization Priorities Study, this is really specifically looking at MnDOT's non-principal arterials. And it has 2 tracks that it could take, looking specifically at what MnDOT has been calling Main Street projects. They're arterials. They also could be PAs that typically run through an urbanized area and serve as a main street. They're very multimodal corridors, and putting some priorities on investment in those types of arterials. The second type of arterials we've been talking about, and we heard about this as part of the TPP, they're non-PA arterials that are typically in the more growing suburban and rural areas of the region. And they're in areas where the PAs are widely spaced. And so to some degree, they play a very large role in travel. They're not super high volume like a freeway would be, but if you live in those areas, they really do serve somewhat of a principal arterial purpose for travel for the people who are living there. And they also are the multimodal corridors in those areas. And they typically are not highly prioritized by MnDOT because they're non-PAs. So for all of those reasons, we're thinking about looking at that set of arterials and putting some thought behind them, prioritizing where and when and how they should be modernized. So that is one study, but it's really kind of 2 things within one study. The second study here, Existing Interchange Modernization Study, really is what it says there. We're looking at prioritizing existing interchanges and to help us think about investing in modernizing those interchanges to address issues such as multimodalism, safety, freight needs. Interchanges are typically modernized when the bridge needs either redecking or replacement. And so these projects are largely driven by bridge needs, but oftentimes they kind of pop up and then we haven't done the pre-work needed to also look at the additional investments that should be occurring as we're replacing the bridge. And so this study would really put a 5 to 8 year priority list together for investments in our existing interchanges. Next slide, please, Judd. This next study, Easy Pass Managed Lane Vision Phase 4. Many of you are familiar with this. We've done obviously 3 of these previously. This one is really coming up. It will be MnDOT led and primarily MnDOT funded. So whether or not this one moves forward is dependent on whether MnDOT receives the remaining funds needed to complete the project. And we would be using UPW funds in the order of $250,000 over a couple-year process for this. And this Phase 4, though, will set priorities for new MnPass lanes, but it will also take another look at our policies behind Easy Pass and MnPass, where and how we implement this system, the types of trips it's serving, probably some look at the rates that we charge and the hours we charge it. So really we'll dig into both the policy and then, as I said, set priorities for new Easy Pass lanes within the region. And then the Highway System Optimization Study. This study is actually in the 2025 UPWP, but it's called the Highway, excess capacity study, highway excess capacity study. And the intent with this study was really to look at both the PA system along with adjacent arterials and identify areas where we might actually have some capacity more than is needed between a series of parallel routes, and then start some discussion on whether there were opportunities to actually reduce capacity in those areas. It's very much a modeling driven study and modeling intensive, and because of that is likely a fairly expensive study where we would be doing multiple scenarios. For that reason, we're starting to really think about whether that level of detail is needed and the outcomes we would get from the study. So any feedback you might have on that effort is welcome. And then one other that I will mention, which we would not likely be a party to funding, and it would be MnDOT led, but MnDOT has done a series of CMSP, congestion mitigation safety studies, and those studies are aimed at setting priorities for what we call low cost, high benefits, spot mobility investments in our regional highway system. It's really been a successful program at getting small projects prioritized within the MnDOT budgets and into the TIP, typically projects that are under 20 million, oftentimes under 10 million. And those efforts really help us get small projects moving, and they do have very high benefits. And while we would not be paying for that effort, we would have staff involved in that effort along with MnDOT, so would further limit our staff time for the studies. So those are the things we have on the table right now. You might have additional thoughts of things that we could be starting up in 2026. So we'll just pause here and see if you have any thoughts on these questions and the studies that we've described to you today.
Thanks, Amy and Jed. Any committee members have comments or questions to start with?
Chair, just to clarifying, do we have authority over council's work program as a procedural question?
Yes, to clarify that, the Unified Planning Work Program starts at TAC Planning. We typically do this information item with TAC Planning, try to get feedback on what we include in the UPWP. The intent then is to come forward with the actual UPWP draft and the business item in June. If we feel we're not ready, we could push that to July, but we're trying to get it into June, at which time we would release it for public comment earlier than normal, with the idea of getting public comment on the proposed work at a point in time when we can still change it. And so, yes, you would be seeing this as a business item next month. There'd be a month break for public comment, and then TAC and TAB would act in August.
So the time to get comment in would then be either now or within the next month?
Yes, exactly. In the next, take this information back, maybe have some discussions internal to your agencies, give us a call, send us something in writing. I do typically remind people that even when we're out for public comment, that is the exact point in time when we are changing the document. So over the next couple months is the time where we want to get something in there and still have the discussion, and maybe over the summer, it can start to take a little bit different shape if needed.
And Amy, just maybe on that process question. So this was a big meeting agenda, and there's a lot of items on this that sound like maybe we may not have funding to do all of them. So it's maybe a start at a well-formulated start at some ideas, but there might be some honing before we see it next, before we release for public comment. I would assume there may be some tweaking that happens. If folks do have internal discussions and want to send those to you, kind of when would you need that by to incorporate that feedback before the next draft is released next month?
Well, we have flexibility, and I pressed Jed to move it up a month to get it out to public comment earlier. So if there is discomfort, we can continue this conversation next month and push out the public comment, because I don't want to rush it, since you really are our technical experts in this area. But we could also come with a draft next month and then see if there's a comfort level of putting it out for public comment and still not acting on it yourselves until July. So we do have some flexibility with that timeline.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and just maybe some of the comments you mentioned about some of the studies maybe have a bigger scope than we can afford. I didn't know if you were planning on intending and sending out this list as the draft for public comment, or if there would need to be some more kind of refinement and revisions to match the list with the available budget and staff time.
Yes, and here's what I'm going to suggest, and I wish I would have thought of this earlier, but we wouldn't have had enough time anyway. We will come back to this discussion next month, and I would ask that you send us any ideas of things you didn't see here. And one thing I would like to do is maybe a Mentimeter on priorities for some of these studies, and just get a general idea if they're resonating and where you're thinking priorities might be. And I think that would be a good way to get feedback in June. And then we'll relook at the public comment dates. But I think, just given the lateness of today and the desire to give some feedback, we won't be coming with an action item in June. And we'll put together a schedule that works a little bit, gives a little more comfort room.
Okay, thanks. I think a lot of these items were MnDOT items, and I'm pretty new to my position, but I know we probably have some more internal discussion to figure out how some of those prioritization tasks fit in with some of our agency corridor planning prioritization tasks, and if there's any overlap there. But I mean, we can talk internally, I think, definitely before the next meeting and get you that feedback, but I didn't want others to also be able to have that opportunity as well.
Yeah, and maybe one last comment for those who might be new to this. The studies that we do as part of the UPWP, they typically are multi-year. They're longer studies, and they're meant to do a variety of things. Some of them are system studies where we delve into just system issues. We help set system policy. Some of the studies are meant to set investment priorities, regional type investments, such as the existing interchanges and modernizing those. And then a third area is technical assistance for local communities. If there are things that, whether it's training or tools or models that we can develop that help your local governments in their work, that's kind of a third area of the type of studies we do. So as you take this back to your agencies, that might be what you want to think about it into those three buckets.
that's helpful context. Does anybody have any final questions or comments on this item? Sounds like we'll be talking about it more again. But yeah, I do think this is one, if you haven't had a chance to think about it and want to bring it back to your internal staff and come back with comments next month or send those on to council staff, I think that would be helpful. Thanks, Amy and Jed.
Right.
I lost my agenda, but I think that was the final information item, hopefully, since it's 3 o'clock. Does anyone have any other business or announcements? Okay, I don't see any. So with that, I will go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Thanks everybody for sticking around, and to staff for all the good information.
Thank you.